2155, humanity may have survived a devastating Third World War, but liberty did not. Now there is only the oppressive Commonwealth and the few independent factions it has yet to assimilate. Because no army can stand against it, resistance is waged with elite agents. These operatives are so dangerous to the world government that it has initiated a program to create its own counter-agents.
Hey, this is Todd Harris. I'm executive producer of Global Agenda.
And Chuck Vinson, I'm the art director for Global Agenda.
And I'm iTZKooPA, and I'll be interviewing these guys on Global Agenda. I guess we'll just start off with a bit of the lore. So far, gamers have heard. We've seen a bit of it, but not too much. It's been said since the beginning, pretty much, that Global Agenda is focused on AVA at its core. And Todd said that in a previous interview that most of these events would be covered in newscasts, the big AVA kind of stuff. Is it possible that some of these events and agencies themselves could become part of the lore, like a piece of the ongoing storyline of the game? So, for instance, maybe an agency does a key defense and holds like its whole territory. Could that be like the focal point for a short story like Utopia?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think, one, you hit on the fact that it's definitely players and player-created groups that we call agencies that are making the story of Global Agenda. So fundamentally, we spend a lot of time on really interesting IP and setting for players to enter. But once they enter the world, it's all about the players and the player groups. And so we're doing things like an in-game newscast to cover the action of players and player groups. And so, yeah, we've, since the beginning, thought that we would take inspiration from what's going on in the game to continue to roll out new content. So one example of that is that within AVA, or Alliance versus Alliance combat, folks are competing for territory, and they can actually achieve different victory conditions before a zone closes, effectively running out of resources. And so that's a pretty major event for the world, and definitely something that will be written into the timeline that future players could read about in short stories, and also just understand from a timeline perspective. Even inspiration for future NPCs and that sort of thing, we may very well take from the player community. So, Chuck.
Yeah, we have some interesting things that we've also kind of worked with in terms of just reflecting the player agency ownership of stuff in the game world. We've been developing the art for the agency-controlled bases. So, the goal is to have your agency logo or your agency colors or whatever kind of reflected in the territory that you own, just to kind of as a tie-in visually, which we all, as people who play the game and would love to own territory, think that'd be really cool, is to actually have it affect things in the world that you see.
And you did mention lore in one particular story, being the Utopian, and so it is a real rich canon of fiction that we've used to build up the Global Agenda universe. So basically the timeline goes from about 2020 to the year 2155, which is when the player enters, and there's 10 plus short stories that kind of give you a view into key world events and anecdotes throughout that timeline. And at a very high level, the player is entering a world where one totalitarian faction called the Commonwealth, a very George Orwell 1984 controlling government, is basically in charge of most of the good territory in Earth. And as a player, you're escaping from their clutches in the tutorial mission, and you're battling them in our player versus environment missions, but eventually you find out, as you mentioned, that the real action is out there in AVA, where player-created agencies are really fighting over the last habitable territory and set of resources and technology on the planet. So,
and the whole basic concept of the game is that Commonwealth NPC organization is so sort of big and overreaching and huge that it's more apt for people to work against them in small numbers of powerful individuals rather than big military conflicts. So that kind of sets up the scene for the players and what the players are doing.
Because ultimately the combat is small strike force, kind of elite squad based combat that we're going for.
So they pretty much is focused on the guerrilla tactics is what all the players are doing against the Commonwealth.
Right, yeah,
that's
right. Basically the framework for all the missions, even when you're playing against other groups. But yeah, all the PvE is anti-Commonwealth sort of, raiding them for resources.
You're basically infiltrating facilities in order to get the goods, so which is loot drops of things like upgrades or components so that players can craft upgrades, and upgrades are our form of persistent buffs. So technology is always increasing in the world. You always want to get the latest upgrades. They give you small little buffs against your enemies in terms of a little more resistance, a little more damage, that sort of thing. So even after your max level, that's one of the progression mechanics in the game.
Can we expect more of the short stories in the lead up to launch and post-launch? And are any of those stories going to be like PvE based, or is it mainly going to be? Is the PvE going to have a story arc itself besides the Commonwealth, or is that just an overarching story, and then we'll get like bite-sized stories for each mission?
It's really an overarching framework. We're really trying to set up the tone of the world with the stories versus deliver storyline-based missions. So we designed our missions actually to have a lot of replayability. One of the cool things about Global Agenda is, one, the classes play very different from each other. Obviously you get that in MMOs, but we've got shooter mechanics, and some of our fan base come from shooters as well, and so really how distinct each class plays is a little bit new for folks used to a guy basically being himself with a gun and a few auxiliary devices. So it's a lot of fun just to go through those missions as a different class. And also we do things within the mission that are dynamic. So the spawns are varied. You might be getting a scanner bot one time who's looking at you with his beam, and if he sees you he's bringing in a bunch of reinforcements, and another time you're getting a massive helot with his minigun that mows down everything in sight, and another time you're getting an assassin who comes out of stealth and takes out your turrets that you worked hard to set up as a robotics.